Okay, one more time. And we're gonna do it right this time. Pay attention to that sub button because it's only gonna happen once. Alright, here we go. Subscribe. Nailed it. Now I won't have to drop a tactical nuke on Google HQ. Your lives are spared. For now. So now that the Genesis version is done, let's take a look at the Super Nintendo version, and see how it holds up in comparison. And I'll throw in the card over here if you want to check that video out. Now, even though I played the Genesis one first, and that was long before I started making a video on the Genesis Sparkster, the Super Nintendo Sparkster came out first, 1 week before the Genesis version. While the Genesis version was directed by Yasushi Takano, who did character designs for Rocket Knight Adventures, while Contra Hardcore's Nobuya Nakazato directed, Hideo Ueda directed and programmed Super Sparkster. I'm gonna refer to the Super Nintendo Sparkster as Super Sparkster from this point onward. Ueda had a lot of Konami games under his belt. He was a programmer for shooters like Axlay, Parodius, Salamander, and has director credits in Gradius Deluxe and Castlevania Chronicles. That's the X68000 Castlevania that was ported to the PS1. The one that's brutally unfair. The one that makes Contra look like Kirby's Epic Yarn by comparison. Why would you do this? There's supposed to be meat in there, you lying sons of bitch. Chronicles was the first game he directed, but I'll cut him some slack. I won't be so forgiving next time. Mark my words. Two potential sequels for Rocket Knight Adventures were in the works. One was just called Sparkster, and then a Genesis version came along called Sparkster, Rocket Knight Adventures 2. So if the Genesis version is the true sequel to Rocket Knight, what does that make the Super Nintendo version? Is it a sequel as well? A pre-sequel? A spin-off? Is it like some kind of parallel universe version of Sparkster? Did the dimensional merge finally happen and I wasn't informed? This game actually does try to have some continuity with Rocket Knight. In the manual, Super Sparkster takes place years after the destruction of the Pigstar, which would put it years after the events of Rocket Knight Adventures. The Genesis manual says that the Genesis game takes place after the Pigstar's destruction at an unspecified time. So it can't specifically say if the Genesis game happened before or after the Super Nintendo game, or if it ever happened at all. What we got was a Sonic 2, Sonic CD scenario where the same company was divided on what a proper sequel should be. As for the Super Nintendo game, yet another massive intergalactic army plans to conquer the world. Same shit, different world, different princess, different villain. A coup d'etat was thrown against King Eginizim and the kingdom of the same name by Generalissimo Lioness. He commands a whole army of wolves at his disposal, along with his right-hand men, Colonel Wolfheim and Axel Gear. This motherfucker just doesn't know when to quit. He's only good at two things: kidnapping princesses and getting his ass kicked for it, and quote, disabling possums. Three things he's good at. Oh! The king of the kingdom of I probably pronounced it wrong and who cares, entrusts his daughter, Princess Flora, with a much sought-after magical pendant believed to preserve peace. The king basically put a kidnap me sign on his daughter's back when he entrusted her with their most valuable possession. Axel naps her and takes the pendant to Lioness. What exactly does Lioness plan to do with this pendant? You're just gonna have to wait and see. So now Sparkster is tasked with saving the princess and saving the world once again because he's the best jetpack possum for the job. Honestly, I feel like he's the only jetpack possum for the job. The other one is a massive traitor. These are the only two Rocket Knights I've ever seen in 3 games. This series has only one plot and they copied it 3 times. All they did was change the names.
That's about it.
And one more thing I should point out. This time the enemies are actual predators for possums. Wolves. Instead of pigs or reptiles. Now, you would expect Lioness's army to consist of lions, right? Of course not, that would be stupid. It's wolves, obviously. So how is the gameplay compared to the Genesis Sparkster? Now, we've been told our whole lives that the Genesis is faster. It has a much more powerful CPU than the Super Nintendo. Blast processing and such. When you dash in Super Sparkster, you hit Mach 1 as soon as you let go of the attack button. He goes apeshit in this version. You bounce around so fast that you lose track of him until he stops. You let go of the attack button and let Faith handle the rest. The game becomes lightspeed pinball at times. but the shoulder buttons do remedy the problem to some extent. I have died once or twice because of this. It happens in the other games, but at least I could kind of see where I was going. Unless you've played this game a bunch of times and know what's ahead of you, you're gonna be taking hits constantly. The tool-assisted runs of these games are what you would expect them to be. Vomit-inducing fun, like a good TAS should be. Even the screen scrolling is stupid fast when you do it. How is this even possible? Well, Konami has made some great Super Nintendo games before. Super Castlevania 4, Contra 3, the Ninja Turtles SNES games, just to name a few. Also, Ueda, the game's director, programmed Axley. He loves it so much it's basically his name now. And I can't complain, Axley fucking slaps. Konami has plenty of experience with the hardware at this point, and they drastically improved over the years. But as fast as Sparky can get, the game does have some awful slowdown. The Super Nintendo may be a fine piece of hardware for its time, but even that can have limitations as well. Genesis Sparkster wasn't exactly perfect in this regard either, but the slowdown isn't as bad as the slowdown in something like Gradius 3, one of the first games Konami put on the Super Nintendo, and one of the first Super Nintendo titles ever made. Konami can only go up from that bubble level. Now for the stuff that really makes the Super Nintendo Sparkster a new animal compared to the Genesis version. Sparky gets a new attack with the shoulder buttons. He can do a rolling attack that micro-dashes you into whatever direction you want. You can straight up combine the charge dash and the rolling attack. And the airtime you can achieve with this is beyond stupid. The rolling attack allows you to attack while holding down the Y button. You can just cancel a roll into a dash. I am starting to favor the gameplay in this version of Sparkster, but you don't get the auto-charging dash meter with 2 levels. But you also get your projectile back. But there is one issue where you can freefall if you spam the shoulder buttons, leaving you vulnerable. You can't spam or else.
You'll be sucked.
You can also overheat your jetpack if you hold your charge, which also leaves you vulnerable. Genesis Sparkster never had this problem, but I think I'd rather have a dedicated dash button instead of charging. The SNES controller definitely has enough buttons for it. There's more health this time around, 2 more hearts than the Genesis version, but 1 less than Rocket Knight. But the best part about Super Sparkster is the gems. No more of that roulette bullshit dropping bombs all the fucking time. Now it behaves more like Mario coins where 100 is an extra life. I have an actual incentive to collect these things now. I will take this over the alternative anytime. I'm still pissed about it. Sparky is a lot more animated this time. He still has that 90s attitude, but he has more of those cartoon-like expressions he used to have in Rocket Knight. Like his animations when he falls, and when he does the Battletoads shock face when a boss approaches. He's some sort of hybrid between the 2 possums from the Genesis games. A decent balance of the 2. I think this is my favorite interpretation of the jetpack possum so far. Presentation-wise, the game looks great. The Genesis has more bright and vibrant colors, but the SNES has a much larger color palette to work with. Over 32,000 colors with 256 simultaneous colors on screen. And this added color palette allows for some cool effects like the first stage getting darker, or the sprites appearing darker behind these screens, or when he gets covered in red paint. It's the little things. I didn't even notice this at first, but the first boss emerges from a mountain and flies in the background. There also seems to be some kind of gradient effect they were going for. Maybe by dithering or through composite cables these colors would blend better. But I'll be in the cold ground before I go back to composite. Or God forbid, the RF switcher. It may be nostalgic for you, but I'd rather scarf a wet bucket full of meat crop before I think about downgrading. Matt and Trey were right, meat crop should be a swear word. We could argue about which game looks and sounds better until the sun turns into a red giant and renders planet Earth uninhabitable. But I feel like the Super Nintendo version captures the essence of Rocket Knight somewhat better than the Genesis. The Genesis still does parallax better than the Super Nintendo ever could, and some effects just look better on the Genesis. The Super Nintendo also pulls some tricks out of its ass to make these rockets look like they're rotating, and it can also parallax too. Keep in mind that both of these games are pretty late in their consoles' lifespans. It's 1994. The SNES still has a few years left before the N64 takes over, and the Genesis is passing the torch to the Saturn. And also keep in mind that both of these games were in development at the same time, and they both came out 1 year after Rocket Knight Adventures. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. Even crazier considering this was about 2 years after the exodus of Konami employees. and the beginning of another company called Treasure. Super Sparkster has a similar formula to the Genesis games when it comes to level design. This is becoming a thing I've noticed in a lot of Konami games, especially the ones on this channel. The games keep feeding you boss encounters. You can also see this influence in Treasure games. They were ex-Konami employees after all. They believed in the same philosophies when it came to game design. Sprinkle a few jobbers around the map. Then suddenly, a giant-ass robot jumps in from the background and flings a car at you. I'm not sure if Allstate covers this or not, but I feel like it should. I do appreciate the feed me more approach of these games. Just give me giant shit to kill and I'll be happy. I like when my enemies put up a fight. If you're that kind of gamer, Rocket Knight, Sparkster, and Sparkster are definitely for you. Levels in Rocket Knight games are divided into sections with mini-boss encounters throughout. Usually a machine of some sort, or something piloted by Linus's army of wolves. I'm still butthurt that they're not lions. Or some giant core thing with all this shit spinning around it, which puts my Super Nintendo in immense physical pain. I can hear my console screaming in agony with all this slowdown. I'm gonna get to this thing soon. Patience. Super Sparky also has those animated enemies I wish more games had. It's more prevalent in this game than the Genesis Sparkster. Strip wolves down into their underwear because this game will not have gore of any kind. This isn't Revengeance where I can cut a dude into 1,000 pieces of blood-soaked meat cubes. Same company, by the way. I love when they put up a fight, but I love it even more when they have personality. It goes a long way for me. The game just has a ton of charisma thrown into it. Or Riz, as the kids would say. Like the sleeping wolves in the submarine, or Sparky getting covered in red paint, Axel blasting off in the window during the first boss fight. Whoever the fuck this dude is. And this robot bird level that goes hard as fuck. This has Saturday morning cartoon vibes written all over it. Like those cool action ones that become underrated and get a cult following. Not like the other kind of Saturday morning cartoon.
Snooping as usual, I see.
People ask me what YouTube was like in 2007. It's basically this one clip. And those Nintendo licensed CDI games. We call that the Golden Age. The levels themselves come in a wide variety. There are wide open levels with high ceilings to play around in, a pyramid maze level, a high-speed mech bird level, a music level with a functioning keyboard, and a shoot-'em-up level. Genesis Sparkster did have some variety, but not on this level. Some of those levels were a slog to get through. They were annoying at times. They were drawn out and slow for my taste, and they relied on hit-or-miss gimmicks. And Super Sparky also has some hit-or-miss gimmicks too. The submarine has a section where the stage floods and you have to haul ass or else you drown. The margin of error here is small, and one wrong bounce is an instant death. You son of a bitch! And I do like this pyramid level as much as the next guy, but if the boss is on the other side of the pyramid, then couldn't Sparkster just fly over it instead of going inside? There's no tornado stopping me from going outside this time, and I will never understand this music level. It's a cool level. I fuck with it. But how did I get here? And why did Axel decide that this would be the setting for our decisive battle? When Heihachi and Kazuya had their fated battle, they opted for the mouth of an active volcano. Because it was hype as fuck. Look, I fought a complete nobody in a large shaft after he triggered a warhead to explode. And I had to fight him with that explosion chasing our asses. This random dude had a more epic standoff than Axel did in this game. The Genesis ones had much better stages for our final battles. You can't just declare something to be the final and then have 3 of them. Or 16 of them. But one more thing I can say positively about these levels is that there isn't much of that stop and go progression that the Genesis levels had. However, there is this one section with the giant missiles, and it sucks the more I think about it. Or that one fight. Patience. Even though the game is encouraging the living shit out of me to boost through like a madman, I wind up getting my ass kicked by all the hazards. So I have to play it safe sometimes and take it slow. You don't give a man the keys to the Ferrari and make him drive the speed limit. Oh god, it's happening again. Takano, you motherfucker. Depending on how your game goes, a boss fight can leave you with a hand sweat-soaked controller, or you just press Y to win. This game is very inconsistent in spots. I could lose a life to a boss, then I refight him with no issue. I started doubting my own abilities at one point. Am I stupid, or is the game fucking with me? I don't remember certain bosses being this hard, or this easy on my second run. But there are some instances in Super Sparkster where there is no strategy. There is no advice I can give you other than just press the buttons and let Jesus take the wheel, because the boxing match in this game is complete bullshit and depends entirely on Axel's RNG. You can have an easy match, or 3 game overs depending on what happens. This time you get to move around faster and you get a little projectile you can shoot. And you can block, which is a blessing and a curse. You can block his punches, but play too defensively and you lose those hands. And well,
You'll be sucked.
sometimes he'll just continuously spam the punch button and you have to decide whether to block the hits or lose a heart and keep your arms healthy. It's like watching Star Platinum take on the world, but without the knives and steamrollers. But what if I told you there was a fight in this game that's even more bullshit than what I just showed you? Oh, we're gonna get to him too. I still think the bosses were pretty neat considering the bullshit. Like this giant night robot that flies in from the background at the start, drills through the ship and punches through the floor and... Why does it always come back to you? But I like these bosses. Plot infringement aside, just a bunch of cool robot stuff. Some of them have second phases and grow legs and stuff. Like that one Wolfheim fight. Konami's wheelhouse is cool robot stuff. The tool-assisted runs just get in their faces and kamikazes each boss until either it dies or the possum dies. Every millisecond matters, people. You got bosses that split up if you attack their bodies. You fight on top of piano keys. This centipede-like thing. Not as bonkers as Contra Hardcore, but it's still a wild ride nonetheless. And I haven't even gotten to talk about the Axel showdown yet. This time the game does a better job at keeping Axel on screen compared to the Genesis version. He basically does most of the stuff he did in the other games. Except he does a Psycho Crusher now. But the added toolset that Sparkster has makes this a more engaging fight. The game does try its best to keep Axel on screen, and he does follow you if you start climbing. Once Axel's out of the picture, again, there's only one more boss standing in our way. Let's talk about Generalissimo Lioness. Remember when I said there was a fight that was more bullshit than the Axel boxing match? This is it. This is another fight that can either be impossible, or a walk in the park depending on the RNG again. If you get a decent pattern, you can just hack away with the sword and he'll be dead in no time. Or he litters the screen with all this shit and well...
You'll be sucked.
That's the last time I whip this out, I swear. Sometimes he just walks around and does nothing for almost a full minute. Or he traps you in this corridor and he throws the kitchen sink at you. I find myself in a bunch of situations where I can't avoid getting hit no matter what I do. This doesn't even hold a candle to the Gadol fight. It might have been predictable at times, but it was still an honest fight. This is just RNG hell. But if you somehow make it through this madness, Lioness dies. I was expecting a second form, but I guess it wasn't meant to be. Get the princess and haul ass back to Alderaan or Ginizem or whatever. Reunite Flora with her old man. Sit back and watch the credits. That's pretty much the end of Super Sparkster. A little bit of an abrupt ending, but hey, the journey was more fun than the destination. Can't complain, really. They really love doing these credits with Sparkster flying in the sky, don't they? Oh, fuck you, Konami!
Konami video games, so real, they'll blow you away.
Yep. It's got a true ending only available in hard mode. I just looked up a password and went from there. I'm not giving Konami the satisfaction of a second playthrough, while everyone involved in this game's development is probably fixing pachinko machines. So here's how it all goes down. Lioness doesn't die immediately. He uses the princess's pendant to launch a missile at a Ginizem. The peacekeeping pendant launches a missile. Let me repeat that. The peacekeeping pendant launches a fucking missile. So now you have to haul ass to blow up this missile, which is the true final boss of the game. If you're not on hard mode, Lioness just dies and the princess is rescued. I would have assumed that ending would have been the best possible ending as there was no missile launched, but whatever. Get to the rocket, kill some robots, fight whatever the fuck this is. The core, the soul of the missile. Do missiles have souls now? Once you figure out the pattern, you should be all set. It's just a dodge all this shit fight. Sort of like that tree thing in the Genesis version. One of the better boss fights in Super Sparkster. Memorize them patterns. You can negate most of its attacks with your sword. Avoid all the lasers and crap it drops on you. Enjoy the credits. And if it says challenge very hard at the end, I'm throwing my monitor out the fucking window. I went on about the difficulty settings in Rocket Knight and Sparkster previously. Konami were just dicks about these kind of things. Things like renaming difficulty settings, easier settings cutting levels short, the dreaded challenge hard mode screen, and that fucking roulette system. It seemed like Japan had easier Konami games than us Americans for a while. As far as I know, the regional differences are minimal here, which is nice, but the way the game gatekeeps the true ending and final level behind hard mode is kinda shitty. That final boss I just talked about, you can't fight him on normal, and you don't really get anything special when you beat it on hard mode other than that extra level. And when you tell your friends you beat Sparkster on hard, they'll probably call you a liar, or tell you to get a real job. I was able to access all of Genesis Sparkster on normal. Just collect the swords and kick a doll's ass and you're all set. But the true ending for Super Sparkster is not available in normal. Depending on what kind of gamer you are, Super Sparkster on hard will either be a leisure stroll in the park, or the biggest mistake of your life. Because a lot of this game's difficulty stems from either a real challenge, or just dumb luck. Pace yourself. That's the best advice I can give you. So how does it hold up to the Genesis version? The SNES has some things it does better than the Genesis, and vice versa. The SNES is slower due to the hardware. The Genesis is much smoother in that regard. The Genesis takes away the sword projectile and has a slower sword attack overall. The SNES has a faster sword attack and a projectile, but it still relies on charging the attack button for a dash. Genesis has a dedicated dash button with a meter that can double charge. And it also doesn't have this overcharge bullshit that the SNES game has. You get some decent hang time in the SNES version despite some nerfs, but the Genesis version lets you fly forever. The SNES has more levels, 9 compared to the 6 on the Genesis, with some more variety between them, and no painfully long scrolling sections either. Seriously, I hated this. I'd rather wake up during my own autopsy than do this shit again. The boxing in the Genesis version was too easy and exploitable while the SNES boxing was torture. The Genesis has that roulette bullshit and the SNES doesn't, but the SNES doesn't have any upgrades like the gold armor. Bosses felt more balanced in the Genesis version with the boss AI just doing whatever the hell it wanted on the SNES. Gedal was a much better final boss than Lioness or the true final boss. There's no contest here. At least the SNES is more fair with checkpoints than the Genesis. They dropped the ball hard on that one. I do feel like at times the SNES looked more polished than the Genesis version. The SNES is pulling whatever tricks it can in order to upstage the Genesis. Like it's trying to say, look, I can blast process too. Even though it sometimes feels like the bubble level in Gradius 3. God bless the SA1 hacks. Oh, I haven't even begun to talk about the worst part of Super Sparkster. It's this shit right here. I told you I was gonna get to this fucker. And here we are. This thing right here, this core thing with the 4 gems and all this crap spinning around it, this is the worst part about Super Sparkster. Allow me to explain. You have to hit these 4 gems to kill this thing, but you can't really reach the gems because of all this stuff spinning around the core. So you have to either Hail Mary the possum into the gems and shoot with the accuracy of a CSGO aimbot, or take your sweet ass time killing these things so you can have an opening. It also shoots lasers too, which is also a welcomed addition. And you know your boss is fun and engaging when the FAQs tell me that the best strategy is to go to the right and jump and hack away. And if that's the intended strategy, it will take forever to kill this thing. You have any idea how long this takes? Yeah, this sucks. And you have to do this shit all over again if you die. That's probably the most fun thing about it. Still more fun than the missile hallway in the Genesis version. Then again, Shingles is probably more fun than the missile hallway. Okay, I vented enough. Let's talk about the music. Sparkster, or both versions of Sparkster, have some kick-ass chiptunes. But this time we're dealing with 2 radically different pieces of hardware. The Super Nintendo SPC 700 and the Genesis Yamaha 2612. The SPC 700 was done by Sony. a home electronics giant and a massive multimedia conglomerate. And Yamaha, who specialized in electronic instruments. A lot of the top 100 music you heard in the 80s probably had Yamaha synths involved. The SPC 700 allowed for sampled sounds to play through the Super Nintendo's 8 DSP channels. And with only 512 kilobytes of memory to play with, they had to compress the shit out of these samples to make them work. The Genesis only has one channel that can play samples through a solo PCM channel. It was mostly used for drums, voice samples, and sound effects that couldn't be emulated by the FM side of the 2612. The rest of the channels were either FM synths, and those PSG channels used for backwards compatibility with Master System games. But Genesis games were able to take advantage of it. What you get are two radically different approaches to chiptunes, something that was not an issue for Konami's Kukeiha Club, as they have proven themselves to be experts in both SNES and Genesis hardware. Michiru Yamane and Akira Yamaoka were both credited with the music in both versions. Makes sense as most of the music from this game was carried over to the Genesis version. But now we have three new faces: Kazuhiko Uehara, Masahiro Ikariko, and Minako Masuhira. Uehara later became a producer after his sound work on games like the PC-88 Snatcher, Metal Gear 2, and Legend of the Mystical Ninja, just to name a few. I couldn't really find much info on Ikariko and Masahiro. Ikariko did hang around Konami for a while, even writing music for Police Knots, a game that's been in my backlog for far too long. I'll get around to it someday. It's just that the last Kojima game I played didn't exactly leave the best taste in my mouth.
Yeah. Like Mario and Princess Peach.
Who writes this?
Everyone needs to experience this game once. It's just too weird to live, but it's also too rare to die. I owe you a can of Coke if you get that Fear and Loathing reference. Anyway, Matsuhira. She only had 4 game credits on Moby Games, and that's where the trail ends. I wonder where she is now. So, who did the music better? This is basically comparing apples to oranges when you get down to it. The 2612 is much crisper and has a better low end. I always had a soft spot for this hardware, but I've heard some impressive stuff come out of the Super Nintendo. I don't think the Genesis does orchestral music very well in comparison to the Super Nintendo. You compare Shining Force to something like Final Fantasy VI in terms of music and there's just no contest. It's Final Fantasy VI after all, but I think a better example would be something like Gauntlet 4. That's the good stuff. However, the Genesis can do more rock and metal sounding songs way better than the SNES ever could. The Genesis can pull off some wicked guitar solos. That's not to say that the SNES can't shred. It can definitely shred. This shit slaps. How is this not in Smash Bros? And you can get some pretty awesome guitar solos from a Super Nintendo too. I like to think that the Kukeiha Club knew the limitations of both consoles, and they worked around it, providing a unique soundtrack for the two games. It really just comes down to the skill of the composers and programmers at the end of the day. Honestly, I don't think one soundtrack wins over the other. One song that gets shared between the two is what I like to call the main theme of Sparkster. It plays in the very first level in the Genesis and in the shooting stage in the Super Nintendo. One has that Yamaha bass and the drums front and center, with the melody doubled to give it an echo. There isn't much going on in the background. A few high notes and some noises here and there. It's good for what it is, but the SNES version is a completely different story. It has its own intro. It has more recognizable instruments. It's like a rock band with a full orchestra behind it. The drums have cymbals, a hi-hat, toms, and a ride bell, even a timpani. The Genesis was just a snare and a kick. It sounds much fuller. It's fundamentally the same as the Genesis in terms of composition, but on a much larger scale. It only uses 6 of the 8 channels too. Most Konami SNES games only use 6 for music. The Genesis only used 5 of its channels, including the PCM channel. But there are times where I just can't choose which one is better. The Bird song slaps no matter what hardware you use. It's just called Bird in the Super Nintendo version, probably because it's in the Bird level. I'm not here to tell you which one is better. Music is subjective after all. If you like your music raw and heavy, the 2612 has your back. If you're looking for something a little more melodic and orchestral, the SPC 700 will definitely hook you up. If I have to knock the soundtracks for one thing, it's the music level. It's a little too happy for me, and I don't think it meshes well with the rest of the soundtrack. And this is the one song I keep forgetting is in this game. I was just in an enchanted pyramid, how the hell did I wind up here? Man, I miss this era of gaming when animals ran the gaming industry. Buff toads beating the shit out of rats, possums in mechs, and earthworms in spacesuits. I think the time is right for a mascot platformer renaissance. I did enjoy all 3 of the classic possum games, but Rocket Knight Adventures is still the king of the mountain in my opinion. Like both games were just trying to recreate what made the first Rocket Knight so special, but I wouldn't call either game a disappointment. That's just what happens when you put out your best game first. Both Sparkies are pretty good standalone games, and they're probably better than most of the games in their console's libraries. And I'm not affiliated with them in any way, and I probably never will be. But Limited Run Games announced a compilation of the first 3 Rocket Knight games if you're interested. I wish Limited Run did more stuff like this instead of a Plumbers Don't Wear Ties Definitive Edition. Which one of you asked for this? For Christ's sake, my boy's out here starving to death, trapped in console exclusivity hell. The time is right for Block 64 to become a reality. And then there's the 2010 Rocket Knight game. I never got around to playing it, but I've heard good things and bad things about this one. It looks pretty average just from the footage I've seen. And for a lot of gamers, average just isn't good enough. Maybe one day when Konami is desperate enough, they'll blow the dust off Rocket Knight one more time and make another sequel. Or they make another Pachinko remaster with HD graphics. Damn you, Konami!